Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM, your local community radio station representing the voices of your city and made all by volunteers for the love of it. My name's Andy and I will be with you for the next hour. We are broadcasting on Yagara and Turrbal country. And today on the show, we are going to be talking about microplastics and PFAS, aka forever chemicals. There's little tiny things that are all around us and all inside us, in fact, in our bloodstreams and organs and our natural environment. And we can't see them, but we know they're there. We somehow talk about it, but we somehow shut it out, the fact that we've done this to our bodies and our natural environment. But I think it is important to talk about because, one, we'd better figure out what we're doing. Plastic has really not been around that long, and nor has PFAS, and we have spread an awful lot of it around. Is this what we want the future to look like? More of this. And we do want to know, I guess, what it is doing to our bodies and to our environment. But I think one of the reasons, and I've wanted to do this show for quite a long time, is to really ask the question, the philosophical question, is this what we want to be the legacy of our society at this point in history? And if not, what should we change? Are there fundamental changes that need to happen if we're not just going to be the generation that leaves the detritus of our sort of consumer goods forever, into bioaccumulate in the natural world and the bodies of the generations to come? And is there something a bit off about it, about our society, about the way we organise things, if this is the result? And so we don't delve too much into that, but I'd like you to keep it in the back of your mind today as we go through the show. I spoke to Karen Raubenheimer, who is an environmental scientist who specialises in microplastics, and then I spoke to Ian Wright about PFAS, forever chemicals, and there's lots to say, lots to think about, and lots of little tiny particles all around us that are not going away. Let's get into it. We'll hear first from Karen Raubenheimer.
Yeah, hi. I'm Karen Raubenheimer from the University of Wollongong.
And Karen, today we're going to be talking about microplastics, which is a thing that you study. And so I guess first off, let's start with, what are microplastics?
Well, microplastics are generally considered to be 5 millimeters or less, and then you get a smaller category which is called nanoplastics. So anything above 5 millimeters is generally called macroplastics.
So there must be lots of different microplastics around, of different types of plastic and different ways they came to be. I guess, how is it that there came to be microplastics in our environment?
Well, there's two sources. So we have what we call primary microplastics, and they are those that are manufactured to be less than 5 millimeters. So things like the common ones we know are the microbeads in facial scrubs and toothpaste, etc. There's also sandblasting and other applications for primary microplastics. And then the biggest category is the secondary microplastics, which result from the breakdown and abrasion, etc., of the macroplastics. And as you said, that can be any type of polymer. Some break down into shards. Some are sort of like your carpets are sort of a more curly kind of a microplastic. So they come in different shapes as well, which then also results in different effects in the body, etc.
And so the reason microplastics have become a bit of a topic of conversation in environmental circles and in health circles is that these things don't just exist in the places where, we normally use plastic, is that they have spread into a lot of different places in our environment and, in fact, inside our bodies. So can you tell us about how have they managed to spread to the extent they have?
Well, they're obviously a little bit lighter, so they can be carried by wind. We're finding them even in clouds, so they can move within clouds as they move. They move within animals as well, and then obviously they break down wherever they land up. And then waterways, we're even seeing them moving through soil water, and they're also now being taken up into plants. So as we move our food around, they're moving with that as well.
So I think this is the really interesting thing, I guess, that we have this idea of like biological things that are, living and have like, these cells that reproduce and things like that. And then there's these non-biological things that are just static objects, but that microplastics are sort of coming to be found in plants, in bodies of mammals like us, and in fish and things like that. So I guess how is it they come to be in our bodies?
Well, there's a few ways. Obviously ingestion, and then there's inhalation. And we think that the inhalation through your nose is the route into the brain through the olfactory bulb. There's also potentially through your skin if they're small enough. So when you're wearing your plastic raincoat, etc., there's potential for that to be entering through the skin. So, that's some of the main areas, ways it gets into our bodies. It's just multiple ways, I guess.
And you've mentioned there them going into our brains. What other parts of our body are microplastics in?
So they've been found in, basically wherever we look, we're finding them. So it just depends on where they have looked. So we found it, as you say, in the brain, in the placenta, in the heart, in the blood. So there's a number of places. And if we haven't yet published on a finding in the body, it's probably because we haven't studied that yet.
And how many people are we talking here? What percentage of people are we talking have microplastics inside their body?
I think everybody would have it in their bodies. I mean, we obviously haven't studied everybody, but just about everyone they have studied has got some.
All right, well, I guess that brings us to the next part of the question, which is if they are in our bodies, in our plant matter, in our environment, is this a good or a bad thing?
I guess microplastics come with the chemicals that are in the original piece of plastic, if we're talking a macroplastic. So if you think about the traditional bodily functions, if you had to, for instance, swallow a chemical, we've got some natural processes to eliminate it through the liver and kidneys, etc. But with a microplastic, that plastic is hanging around, so it's lingering in the body for longer, which has its own issues from the physical presence of the microplastic. So you get inflammation and other reactions to the foreign body in your body. But then it's also got potential to release those chemicals over a long period of time, whereas they would potentially have been eliminated under normal functions. They're starting to persist in the body a bit longer, which has its own effects. And then I guess in the environment, it's the same thing. It's just hanging around longer, and that chemical will just continually be released as long as that microplastic exists.
And there have been studies by now about the health effects of microplastics on humans and on other species as well. What health effects are there?
So they've linked it to strokes, so cholesterol, even Alzheimer's, obesity. So some of these are a result of the physical presence of a foreign body, but others are a result of the chemicals and additives, so the endocrine disruptors, which can lead to fertility problems, etc. So it's a twofold issue here that we're finding is affecting the body. The extent, with the inhalation into your lungs, I think there's more research needed there to see about the effects on the lungs. Is it something like asbestos type of reaction or not? So I guess we just need more research. It's really difficult to research, because if you're trying to find your control people, you need someone who doesn't have microplastics to compare to, and that's quite a difficult thing to find now. So I guess it's just becoming expensive and difficult.
Yeah, can we talk a bit more about endocrine disruptors, which you've mentioned there, also called BPAs, which seem to be a particularly insidious microplastic and have particularly bad effects on fertility that's been studied. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Well, BPA is one of the additives which would be in the microplastic. So it's been quite well researched with all the effects, and in the EU they've got some limits on endocrine disruptors, but we're finding more and more that really tiny amounts of these endocrine disruptors are affecting us. So it has affected fertility, and there's also some, as I say, obesity that's linked to it. So the endocrine system is a really sort of fragile system, if you want to call it, and susceptible to any change. So the fact that this BPA, which is commonly used and was often used in baby bottles, for instance, and babies are particularly susceptible to these things because they're growing. So it's an area of the population that we need to be protecting. And looking at some of the listings that we're trying to get through in the global treaty for plastics, the application of babies' toys and food contact for babies and children is one of the areas that they're trying to target there for safe additives. Yeah.
So we've talked a bit now about the microplastics that are inside our bodies and what effect they have, but presumably that is quite a small proportion of the total microplastics that are out there, and most of them are in our environment in different ways. And so are there effects from the microplastics that are around us in our environment?
Yeah, so there's some research done. Well, firstly, those that are taken up by plants, it's affecting their ability to photosynthesize. So they're thinking that could potentially affect our production and our food security in the future. For the rest, it's affecting the carbon cycle as well, and climate change. So the way the earth and snow, etc., reflects is potentially being affected. So there's different ways it's working in the environment. If it's in the soil, it can affect water flows, for instance. So there's numerous ways this is affecting our environment. And I guess there's obviously, we've heard more about some of the microplastics in the birds that are crackling now. So yeah, there's just, we're finding more and more issues with it.
All right, so it seems like there's never-ending issues to do with microplastics, and probably no end in sight, because I would assume there's more plastics in the world being made now than there ever was before that we've acquired all these things. And so I guess what can be done about microplastics, and what is being done?
Well, firstly, we've got to clean up what's in the environment because that's going to break down. So I'm not saying clean up the microplastics because that's not feasible. What we need to do is clean up the macroplastics because they will break down into microplastics. We definitely need to reduce our consumption of plastics because we know that only a small percentage of it is recycled or and a lot of it does end up in the environment, particularly in developing countries where the waste infrastructure is not as developed as ours. There's a lot of promotion for reuse of containers and things, but plastics are not the best material for that because the older they get, the more brittle they get and the more they will break down. So probably one of the best things we can do is recycling apart from reduction, but any kind of recycling, be it chemical recycling or mechanical recycling, tends to first grind or crush the plastic, and that in itself creates microplastics. So, they're released from the very beginning. The plastic is inherently friable material, and we add chemicals, additives and things to try and make it stronger and not release microplastics, but we're never going to be successful. So the best thing we can do is just stop using plastics as much as we can and where we don't necessarily need it for certain functions. But for the rest, the next best step is to clean up what's already in the environment because that's going to continue breaking down in the future.
And you mentioned earlier there is a global plastics treaty that's being attempted to gain support. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think your term there, attempted, is a good one. It was supposed to finish, negotiations were supposed to finish at the end of last year in Korea, but they couldn't reach any agreement. There's still very bipolar agreements on this, and some countries, particularly the oil countries, are trying to bring it down to national measures that are voluntary, whereas a lot of the countries, the majority of the countries, want a strong agreement, and that includes releases of microplastics to be controlled. So we've got the next meeting in Geneva early August, and that's supposed to again be the final meeting, but it's a long way to go, and with such opposing views on certain things, I don't know if we're going to finish in Geneva, my opinion. But we wait and see, and we hope that those with a high ambition can keep lobbying and working with those other countries to get something that's worthwhile, because if it's not worthwhile, it's a very expensive agreement to administer, and you want to have some effect in the end, at least.
Yeah, there is a lot of, greenwashing around the world in various ways that people want to look sustainable, and you get some kind of cultural or financial capital from looking sustainable, but that's not necessarily the thing that makes the most change. Is this the case when it comes to plastics?
Yeah, we're finding a lot of the chemical industry, who makes plastics as well as the chemicals that go into plastics, are pretending to make all the efforts to solve the pollution problem, and they see it as a pollution waste problem. So they're putting money into waste management, which is end of life kind of treatment. And we really need to be focusing on the upstream, so the design and the reduction, etc. So there's greenwashing in that way. There's a lot of greenwashing when it comes to things like the BPA, which you mentioned. They just switched to something like BPS, which is very similar but possibly even worse. And they can say they're BPA free. So the chemical component of plastics is a real issue, because we don't have full clarity on what chemicals are used in plastics, what they're used for. So if you know what the function of the chemical is, you can look for alternatives that could do the same function that are safer. So there's just no transparency around this. There's very little transparency. And that's something we're trying to fix in the agreement as well, but it's a very difficult thing because of intellectual property, etc. So yeah, there's a long way to go to fix plastics.
I think it's an interesting issue philosophically, I guess, in that the history of plastic, and it's only really like 80 years old in common usage, but it has kind of accompanied this incredible explosion in our living standards with the ability to cheaply manufacture things, but also there's real hygiene gains that have been made through plastics and things like that. And so it has, we've gained out of it, but we've also done this incredible environmental damage. I guess it's interesting philosophically then to be like, what do we do about? What's our responsibility? Do you think about that?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, to me, it boils down to overconsumption. We just consume too much, and everything comes either wrapped in plastic or made of plastic. I think it became too easy. I always say we lost the environment when the world got cheap. And plastics are just cheap. So where we possibly had other alternatives, we switched to plastics. And we're now sitting with this problem. I agree. We've got great gains from plastics, and we potentially would have had bigger climate impacts without plastics. But we just need to manage it properly. There's a lot of plastics we don't need to use. I still see young people in the shops grabbing a plastic bag to put one onion in it, and I'm going, people say the youth will fix it. I go, well, I don't know. We're just in the habit of using it, and we also don't know what it's in. A lot of people are not aware that some of the clothing they wear is plastic. So it's a big problem. It's a education problem. It's an ethical problem. I don't know that we can rely on industry to fix this by themselves. We need to be pushing them. People need to be pushing them. Governments need to be pushing them. It's got to come from both sides, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess that does bring us to the question for people that are concerned about microplastics. What should we be doing about it?
I mean, as I say, the best thing is just not to use plastics, because every plastic's going to give off microplastics at some point. So the best thing is to try and make sure you're buying clothes that are made out of natural fibres. Obviously, don't use plastic bags. Don't put plastic in the microwave. Heat makes it release more microplastics. So heat your food up on a plate rather than in a Tupperware. So the best thing is just not to use it as much as you can. That's the only thing I can say. And then if you are going to use it, make sure it's not going to end up in the environment in some way. So, try to make sure it goes it's being sorted properly so that it goes into recycling and not into landfill, where it's also going to break down and leach into the soil and the water. So firstly, don't use it. And secondly, try to use it properly if you have to.
I guess we do have one recent example of a social movement in some way that to try to ban plastic straws, disposable plastic straws. Is this a useful case study for us in how we can slowly change the overconsumption of plastic? Yeah, something which we've just got into the habit of having a straw. It brings out sort of two things here, just the way it's been introduced and the way it's just given to us. If you go to a shop and you order a soft drink, it just comes with a straw, but I didn't want a straw. So instead of asking first if you'd want a straw or banning them entirely, you just sort of given it. But the other angle is when you try and ban something, you then have to look at, are there certain parts of society that do need a straw? And we know that for very elderly people or disabled people, it's a very useful thing to be able to feed them through a straw. So you end up having to look at the application of the product and where is it necessary and where is it not necessary, and then you can ban it, but you probably or may need to have some exceptions where it's allowed to be used for particular applications. Do you think that the campaign, and it's had its kind of pushback from industry and from people like Donald Trump as well, but was it a good campaign? I guess, is it a symbol of how sort of government regulation and consumer pressure and things like that can bring about a change?
Yeah, definitely. So these types of campaigns, whether they're successful or not, always raise awareness. So that's always a good thing. I guess, my experience with industry, they're happy to fight this because it's a diversion of energy and effort, and it takes us away from the real problems. And straws, like plastic bags, are such a minuscule component of what is produced from plastic manufacturers that they're happy to fight this battle. And it serves as an example of how difficult it's going to be to remove something that's already on the market. But, they're happy to take up our time and our efforts, and hopefully we'll get tired and go away. But the good thing is that these always raise awareness with people, and they become more and more aware of, well, do I need this? Don't I need this? And you can bring out all sorts of issues like the microplastics, etc.
Okay. Thanks very much for chatting with us today, Karen.
Thanks you. I'll chat soon.
You are listening to 4ZZZ. The Paradigm Shift is the show. And we were speaking with Karen Raubenheimer about microplastics, and it's just one of those things, isn't it? It's the scale of it is really hard to sort of comprehend or think about it, what we can do about it. And it just really is a reminder of how much we have to do, to make a society that's truly sustainable for a long, long way into the future, and for all the different species out there. And we're not there yet. We're a long way off. But I guess that's the thing. We've got to start with little steps, and it's easy to ridicule, the idea of refusing plastic packaging or straws or things like that. But we have to do something, and we have to confront the fact that we as a culture are generating all of this stuff that is forever lingering around in our environments, in our bodies, in the bodies of our, children and descendants and things like that. Speaking of things that hang around forever and are very small, there's also PFAS, or forever chemicals as they are known. They're a more specific little particle that are even more sort of insidious than microplastics. And I spoke to Ian Wright, who is environmental scientist and who has put a lot of work into studying PFAS. And again, it's one of these things we kind of hear about, and maybe we joke about it. I guess the toxicity of our world, that PFAS is like a part of that. But I thought, let's delve into it a bit more, talk about what are these things, what effect are they having, and what can we do about it.
My name's Ian Wright. I'm a water scientist. My position is I'm an associate professor in the School of Science at Western Sydney University, and I'm fascinated by water and every interaction that people have with water. And my interest in this topic is often PFAS gets into people through water or through their food.
Yes, we are talking about PFAS today, or forever chemicals as they are sometimes known. So to start off with, could you give us a bit of an explanation of what it is we're talking about?
Yeah, PFAS it's one of those horrible acronyms that gets thrown around. Its full name is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and they're incredible molecules that have been made by human society since the 1950s, and they're chains of carbon bonded with fluorine, and these are incredibly strong bonds, and it makes really, really useful things like Teflon and moisture-resistant clothing sprays, and they're in cosmetics and takeaway food containers, and really, really good, except they don't break down. They persist in the environment, they build up in parts of the environment, and they build up in wildlife and people.
So when you say they don't break down, obviously they must to some extent, because they don't remain forever as the original object they were constructed as part of. So I mean, what do they look like in their sort of forever substance?
Oh, absolutely. So they've got some really, really strange behaviours, but one of them, a bit like lead or mercury, both of those, if they come into an organism or a human or, a shark, they bioaccumulate. So they might be quite dispersed in the water or in the food chain at low concentrations, and as you go up the food chain, they can build and build and build. And I'll give you an example. My research group at Western Sydney University, I've got a PhD student who studies platypus, and as part of her work, she was given bodies of platypus that sadly had been found by members of the public that were dead. So she looked and sampled their liver and found enormously high concentrations of PFAS. So although quite dispersed in the environment, it can build and build and build, and it does exactly that with us as well.
So we're talking like microscopic small amounts of it here.
Yes, we are. And it's actually really hard to visualise what low concentrations of these chemicals, and there's thousands of these chemicals, like there's thousands of different types. We just know probably that pollution behaviour of perhaps a dozen of them quite well. But, for example, one of them has the acronym PFOS, and that's often associated with a firefighting foam. It's like a giant bubble bath. Now, PFOS is one of the ones that bioaccumulates, and one single drop of it in about 5 Olympic swimming pools is dangerous for us as humans to drink. And it's also dangerous for, cattle to drink and wildlife. The concentrations that it's really hard to comprehend, but because it has such strong properties in terms of bioaccumulation, and the molecules bind to molecules, can build up and have a whole raft of adverse consequences.
Yes, I am interested in talking about those adverse effects, but first off, I guess, where do they come from? How do they get into our environment?
You know what? We're still learning. We're still learning how it gets in. So in Australia, we have mainly associated PFAS contamination with things like military bases or firefighting training stations, where they'd often people had, and it's particularly the firefighters, had particularly trained with how to put out a burning, building object or burning aircraft. So often they train, and mountains of foam are created. I mean, who thinks of a bubble bath being a dangerous thing? So that's often washed off into drains, and that has seeped into, the soil, the local water table, even into the local creek. Similar in America, runoff from the factories that made these chemicals, at small concentrations, seeped off into the local waterway in particular. And from there, that's really dangerous pathway. It can get in the water supply, depending on where the water is sourced. But if it's in the waterway, it can be in the fish, it can be in, the frogs, and it can even be taken up into, plants and fruit and so on.
So I guess the big question is, if these things are everywhere and they never break down, are they harmful for human health and for the environment?
Yes, they are, and there is a strong and growing body of knowledge, but I think Australia is still rather slow to appreciate the magnitude of this, and there does seem to be a reluctance amongst political leaders across Australia to take this as seriously as they should. So after, based particularly on the pollution that's been documented in America, the US EPA has actually become the world leaders on how to manage this. And they have sued one of the companies that made these chemicals, and they've got billions of dollars. So they're kind of leading it, they're funding research. We've got evidence growing that people with high levels of these PFAS chemicals in their system, and simple blood test can give a very good estimate, even though it generally builds up in, liver and kidneys. There is an association from the growing medical history of people that if you have high concentration of the PFAS chemicals in you, you are also likely to have a link to other issues. And there are some cancers, some cardiovascular disease, changes to immune system, changes to human development. There is a lot. And with each day, week and month, more evidence is emerging. So, but in Australia, we are still probably not taking it as seriously as we should.
So what kind of things are being done about PFAS to stop further spread and to do something about what's already out there in our environment?
There are several things happening. One of the big ones is banning chemicals that were most associated with problems. So, for example, the PFAS, the firefighting foam that was used was particularly dangerous, and it has been an enormous occupational health issue for firefighters. Victorian firefighters in particular have had an enormous concern about impacts of that on their workers. But so there's been a whole lot of chemicals banned as that evidence emerges. Again, Australia, a bit slow to do it, but progressively, when it builds to a point, they can actually ban certain products. So that's one of the main ones. Second one, there has been testing around anywhere that there has been doing lots of training with firefighting, so particularly military bases and fire brigade areas where they train their staff. So lots of testing at places like that, and that has identified quite a lot of hotspots, and there's remediation of those, removing contaminated soil. It's slow and difficult and expensive, but you can even remediate contaminated groundwater. And I suppose the third big one that I'm particularly happy about, it's close to my industry, and that's water. We are now routinely measuring it in our drinking water supply. But across Australia, that is not consistent everywhere. I know here in Sydney, we only started testing and getting information on it in July, August last year, after, frankly, years of pushing to test for this. And, surprise, surprise, across our water supply of Sydney, which is about 5.5 million people, a small community in the Blue Mountains was found to have very high PFAS levels. It's now being filtered, treated, but if you don't measure it, you won't find it. And then the community up there is now wondering what to do about it. And it triggers, if you don't know it's there, you can't take action, and it's kind of like a metaphorical ostrich with a head in the sand.
So that one in the Blue Mountains is interesting because I guess there's been other places where there's been higher levels of contamination, but the Blue Mountains has been in the news recently because it's gone to court, and because there's also been a decision in the community's favour that there will be extra water filtration measures. So I guess I'm interested in, do you think that has been a good process, and have the results of the filtration been good?
It's a really complicated story. So the court action has started. It's a class action. It's actually only at the early stages. The treatment of the water, that was basically by the court of public opinion. And to be honest, I was reasonably involved in it. In fact, my name's mud in many government circles because I had some ideas where the contamination might be in August, September last year, but I took a sample of the hotspot, and that hotspot appears to be a 1992 burning petrol tanker. And you can imagine, 30,000 litres of burning fuel. The fire brigade had an incredible job on their hands to subdue the fire. And as they did in 1992, they used a PFAS foaming agent. And you sort of need that foaming agent. Water doesn't is not that effective in a burning fuel fire. It's 1992 that happened. The runoff from that is still contaminating the soil and the groundwater. And I've sampled it a couple of times. And that just happens to be a small drinking water catchment that's otherwise not far off pristine. And it's played out more in the media, and it's been messy. I'm one of many that, you have a science problem, you collect data, you take action. And on this one, I've been very frustrated with how slow that happened. And just a matter of months before that, I was, interviewed in the press, and New South Wales Chief Health Scientist said there are no known hotspots in Sydney's water supply, basically saying just calm down. And my response was, well, you're not going to find them if you don't test for them. They test for them, they found them. And now the community is taking action and the water industry is cleaning it. It is kind of a frustrating process.
Has it been a good result, the filtration process?
It's been a great result in that sense. So, our water provider in Sydney is very well funded, and they very quickly improved the local treatment. And there's all kinds of things you can do with PFAS to filter it out. But the issue that is very much unresolved is that blood testing is relatively routine, but it's still very expensive. It's about $500 to $600 to have a blood sample tested for PFAS, but you won't get it on bulk billing, and your health fund generally won't cover you. And the government and the water authorities are in lockstep denying community members testing. And a few people that are particularly concerned or are, have the funds available are getting tests. And we now know a lot of their PFAS levels in their system is very high and legitimately of considerable concern.
So you mentioned that PFAS has stopped being used in firefighting foam. I guess the big question is, are there things we can do to remove these forever chemicals from our usage?
Oh, absolutely. I applaud taking action and banning the most harmful of the chemicals, but it is really hard to control something when new chemicals are invented all the time. They're developed. Often the tests they do before they are allowed out into, broader society, it's questionable whether they're representative of the actual risks. The more we hear about the companies that made these PFAS chemicals, they were actually aware decades earlier of the hazards and risks, even to their own workers, that got occupational exposure. But they made lots of money, so, that imperative of commercial success and the dollar seems really powerful. But, we're testing more. Last week, Australian Bureau of Statistics produced a fantastic data set based on 7,000 blood samples representing all Australians. And so now we know what is typical or normal for your, age group and gender. So look, they're step by step by step. We're getting better at this, but still advice on what individuals can do to avoid it in their diet. We've still got a long way to go there, I believe.
Yeah, so I guess one question that I think about is, what does all this say about our society and how we're living at this point in history and the legacy that we're leaving for sort of the future generations? And what should we be doing about that?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Look, I think about that quite a lot. Often, the food we eat is highly processed. You don't really know what is in it, and it is a big act of trust. When you eat something, you take it into your body. You drink water from the tap. That's an act of trust. And in some ways, we have been, very trusting of government and of commerce, that they've got our best interests in their heart. And this makes me realise, no, not necessarily. We need to be very careful. I think the lessons we might learn from PFAS are highly relevant for things. There's all kinds of other contaminants. We live in a very industrial society. So what other sort of contaminants, such as, antibiotics and, pharmaceutical drugs, illicit drugs, they're getting into, a food chain and water supply. And things we can learn from managing PFAS can also help there. And in this industrial society, we do need to be very vigilant that, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat is safe. And it's not as safe as it should be.
All right. Thanks very much, Ian, for chatting with us today.
Absolute pleasure. All the best, Andy. Thank you.
That is Ian Wright talking about PFAS. Forever chemicals. Earlier in the show, we did have Karen Raubenheimer talking about microplastics. These things, they're very small, but they're very numerous, and they should be of large concern. I suppose health effects in low concentrations, we shouldn't, I suppose, be too alarmed immediately, but certainly where they have been largely concentrated, they have had well-documented effects on health and fertility and things like that, and they bioaccumulate over time. There's more of them coming, and certainly it's something to worry about. And like I have said a couple of times, I think there's an existential worry about what is our legacy. You hope that you leave the world in a better place after your life, and hopefully through our interactions with other people we've managed to do that. But then when you think about our material legacy from the things that we've used, the question is that leaving the world a better place? And these are the kind of questions that we should be asking when it comes to microplastics and PFAS and things like that. That is all we have time for on the Paradigm Shift. See you next week.